Mistress convinced Billionaire to declare pregnant wife dead after accident, but she was watching. Xavier Lancaster was known throughout New York's upper circles as the visionary millionaire who had everything: wealth, charm, and a radiant wife who was pregnant with his heir. Yet, behind the scenes of his impeccable reputation, a sinister scheme was brewing. One stormy night, a deadly accident seemed to claim the life of his pregnant wife, Elizabeth. Encouraged by his cunning mistress, Claudia, Xavier publicly declared Elizabeth dead, desperate to move on with a glittering future free of obligations. But what neither Xavier nor Claudia realized was that Elizabeth had survived, and she was watching every move they made, determined to reclaim what was hers. Rain drummed against the lofty windows of the Lancaster estate, a Gilded Age mansion nestled amid tall oaks in Westchester County. Xavier Lancaster, barely 35, reclined in his leather armchair, savoring the night's quiet. A self-made millionaire through a series of technology startups and savvy real estate investments, he represented ambition incarnate. Handsome in a clean-cut, confident way, he had always possessed the ability to command a room with little more than a smile. His wife, Elizabeth Lancaster, née Moretti, was from a respectable, old money family in Boston. Their marriage was the culmination of two storied lineages. Although they came from different backgrounds, his was one of near poverty and hustle, hers rooted in generational comfort. They shared a hunger for success. Elizabeth's refined upbringing provided her an elegance that perfectly complemented Xavier's fire. The synergy made them one of New York's most enviable couples. But behind the polished veneer lay buried secrets and private anxieties. Elizabeth was newly pregnant, just shy of her first trimester. The news had rippled quietly through the household like a gentle wave. They had chosen not to announce her pregnancy yet, wanting to be sure everything was healthy. Nonetheless, the staff whispered excitedly about a future heir to the Lancaster fortune, dreaming of nursery renovations and anticipating Elizabeth's blossoming maternal glow. No one seemed more thrilled than Elizabeth herself. She had never been comfortable in the role of the billionaire's wife, but with the promise of a child, she felt a deeper purpose. The gentle glimmer in her eyes whenever she stroked her still flat belly painted a portrait of maternal grace. At times, however, a flicker of restlessness would cloud Xavier's gaze, particularly when the talk turned to the baby. His empire was a demanding mistress in itself, requiring relentless travel and constant negotiations. He struggled with the idea of parenthood. Had he been willing to truly change his lifestyle for a family, or was it only Elizabeth's dream? In the midst of these questionings, a different kind of tension simmered. Claudia Ramirez, Xavier's marketing director, was a frequent presence in the Lancaster household on business matters. She was sharp, ambitious, and sultry in a way that attracted looks in any room. Although nothing overtly inappropriate had yet crossed the threshold, an undeniable spark crackled between them. Claudia and Xavier had known each other for 3 years. She had been the first employee at Xavier's newly formed PR firm after he sold his first startup. He trusted her instincts and intelligence, perhaps too much. Whenever Elizabeth entered a room where they were talking, she often felt an invisible barrier, as though she were witnessing an exchange in a language she didn't speak. Still, as the Lancaster mansion glowed in the waning twilight, Elizabeth felt a surge of optimism. She believed the baby would bring Xavier and her even closer, binding their hearts and bridging unspoken distances. She could not have known how drastically her world would soon unravel, or that the greatest threat to her and her child's future would come from the very person she trusted most. The next morning, Elizabeth awoke to find Xavier gone yet again before sunrise. A quick glance at her phone confirmed an abrupt business trip had called him to Chicago. His text message was terse and apologetic, though Elizabeth sensed something else beneath his excuses for leaving. She tried not to dwell on her growing unease. Later that day, she found herself wandering through the halls, noticing small details of the house that had once felt like home. Now, everything seemed a shade darker, as though the building itself had begun to reflect her uncertainty. She paused in front of a large framed painting by an obscure European artist, Xavier's first extravagant purchase after his initial success. The swirling brushstrokes depicted a woman in a red dress, standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into a storm-tossed sea. Elizabeth had once considered it a representation of boldness. Now, it seemed a portrait of danger. A faint sound drew her toward the living room. There, she stumbled upon Claudia chatting with Mr. Holland, the estate's property manager. Claudia was reviewing some marketing materials on a sleek tablet, the type that Xavier always carried. Before they noticed Elizabeth, she caught sight of Xavier's personal logo on the screen files from his ongoing deals. Claudia had apparently received them directly from him, bypassing Elizabeth entirely. Elizabeth tried to remind herself that Xavier and Claudia worked closely, but an unsettling question nagged at her. Why did Claudia appear so comfortable in their home? The subtle shift of her posture, the casual wave in which she dismissed Mr. Holland, suggested an authority that didn't belong to a mere employee. Yet the moment Claudia noticed Elizabeth, her expression melted into polite affability. "Elizabeth, good morning," she greeted, all sweet efficiency. "I was just going over some urgent documents for Xavier. How are you feeling today?" Elizabeth managed a weary smile. "I'm all right, thank you. The nausea was worse yesterday, but it's subsiding now." Claudia's gaze flicked to Elizabeth's abdomen for a moment. "You should take care. These months can be precarious." The tone was almost genuine, but something in Claudia's eyes unsettled Elizabeth. It was as though a cat was studying a mouse, deciding whether or not to pounce. The faint tension coiling in the room finally pushed Elizabeth to excuse herself and retreat upstairs. Over the next few days, Elizabeth tried to contact Xavier, but his responses were persistently delayed. Excuses about back-to-back meetings, late-night networking events, and flights that seemed to multiply. Meanwhile, Claudia's presence at the estate seemed to grow. She supervised staff members, spoke on Xavier's behalf, and fielded calls for him. She was becoming the vital link between the mansion and Xavier's busy world outside. Late one evening, Elizabeth reached for her laptop to check her emails. Suddenly, a new message from an old friend popped up. The friend wrote that she had spotted Xavier at a swanky Chicago restaurant, except he hadn't been alone. Beside him sat a striking woman with dark hair, wearing a form-fitting dress that seemed alarmingly reminiscent of something Claudia might choose. Elizabeth's heart pounded. Suspicion solidified, evolving from a vague worry to a terrifying certainty. Back at the Lancaster estate, Elizabeth felt more isolated than ever. Her attempts to discuss the matter of Xavier's closeness with Claudia only led to tense arguments over the phone. When Elizabeth pressed him about the restaurant sighting, Xavier's voice sharpened with annoyance. "You're being ridiculous, Elizabeth. Claudia was with me, yes, but only for business. We were finalizing a major distribution deal. But why did you never mention she'd be in Chicago?" Elizabeth's tone was trembling but resolute. "I didn't think it was relevant. Please, trust me." The conversation ended on a heavy note, leaving Elizabeth feeling hollow. Something vital in their relationship seemed to be breaking. Days turned into a storm of anxiety and half-answered questions. Xavier's phone calls grew shorter, and her once confident husband now sounded perpetually on edge. In an attempt to clear her head, Elizabeth drove into Manhattan to meet her longtime confidant, Dr. Sophia Hayashi, a well-respected OB-GYN at Mount Sinai Hospital. Sophia had been monitoring Elizabeth's pregnancy from the earliest days. Over tea in the hospital's bustling cafeteria, Elizabeth recounted her concerns in hushed tones. Sophia listened intently, her kind eyes revealing concern. "Your stress is understandable, Elizabeth, but you need to be mindful of your health. High stress can have real implications for you and the baby. If you suspect something is wrong in your marriage, gather facts, but please protect your peace as well." Elizabeth nodded, feeling somewhat comforted to have a listening ear. She left the hospital with a resolution to remain calm and think strategically. She would watch Claudia more carefully, observe her movements in the estate, and above all, try to speak openly with Xavier when he returned. But everything shifted again when she arrived back home that evening. In the mansion's grand foyer, she noticed a small set of suitcases placed neatly by the door. Next to them, Mr. Holland was standing with a furtive expression. "Mrs. Lancaster," he said, his voice subdued. "Miss Ramirez instructed me to have these sent to Mr. Xavier's personal apartment in the city." Elizabeth glanced at the tags. They were monogrammed with Xavier's initials, but contained items she recognized: a favorite sweater, custom-tailored suits, and even the cologne she had gifted him. Why was Claudia taking Xavier's personal belongings? Was he not coming home? Elizabeth's mind raced. She called Xavier's phone, but once again it went straight to voicemail. On a whim, she tried calling one of his business associates. That friend simply claimed Xavier was tied up in meetings and not to worry. In her restless sleep, Elizabeth found herself dreaming of swirling waters, the same stormy sea that had appeared in Xavier's cherished painting. It felt like a warning, the sense that something cataclysmic was on the horizon. What she did not realize was that, behind closed doors, Claudia was whispering poison into Xavier's ear, sowing seeds of doubt about Elizabeth's devotion, about the pregnancy itself, about whether Elizabeth was truly the person Xavier needed by his side. 2 weeks passed without Xavier setting foot in the estate. To the outside world, he was simply engrossed in deals, but to Elizabeth, it felt like an intentional distancing. Then came the night that would change her life forever. A severe rainstorm pelted New York with an intensity not seen in years. Flood warnings scrolled across television screens. Winds howled through the night. Despite the weather, Elizabeth had an urgent need to see Xavier and resolve the growing crisis in their marriage. She discovered he was at a high-profile gala in Manhattan, an event rumored to celebrate a new philanthropic partnership with a major tech giant. Someone like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett might even have been there, though the details were fuzzy. Elizabeth decided to drive there herself, ignoring the staff's concerns about the storm. She navigated the slick roads, wipers thrashing against the windshield. The city's neon lights blurred in the downpour, giving the drive an otherworldly atmosphere. All the while, her anxiety was a static buzz in her mind. Would she find Xavier with Claudia? What would she say? Could she fix this fracturing marriage before it was too late? Halfway down a desolate stretch of highway, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated something lying in the road. Elizabeth swerved to avoid it, her tires losing traction on the rain-soaked pavement. The car veered into a spin, smashing through the guardrail. She felt the vehicle tumble, metal screeching, glass shattering, and then a sudden, horrifying silence as she plummeted into a wooded embankment. Dazed, Elizabeth's vision blurred. Her body was pinned by twisted metal, and an acute pain seared through her abdomen. In that moment, fear for her unborn child overshadowed even her own terror. The storm hammered her motionless car, water sloshing into the shattered windows. She fumbled for her phone, only to realize it was gone. Hours seemed to pass, though it might have been minutes. Miraculously, a passing driver saw the destroyed guardrail and called for help. Medics arrived, carefully extracting Elizabeth from the wreckage. Through excruciating pain, she clung to consciousness long enough to see the paramedics glance at each other grimly as they transferred her onto a stretcher. "Try to stay with us," one of them said. "We're taking you to the nearest hospital." That was the last thing Elizabeth remembered before everything went black. Meanwhile, the news spread swiftly, from highway patrol to hospital staff to frantic phone calls. By the time the clock struck 3 in the morning, Xavier had been notified. Yet, under the spell of Claudia's manipulations, his reaction was eerily muted. The man who once claimed to love Elizabeth beyond reason was now weighed down by complex emotions: duty, fear, guilt, or perhaps a darker relief. Somewhere, in a dimly lit suite in Manhattan, Claudia's eyes glimmered with an unspoken opportunity. If Elizabeth and her unborn child were truly out of the picture, then nothing would stand in the way of Claudia's ambitions. She placed a delicate hand on Xavier's shoulder. "We should go to the hospital," she murmured. "But remember, sometimes these tragedies happen for a reason." At the hospital, the atmosphere was frantic. Surgeons worked feverishly to stabilize Elizabeth. She had suffered severe head trauma, internal bleeding, and multiple fractures. Yet, amidst this grim reality, her baby's heartbeat, though faint, still pulsed on the fetal monitor. Xavier arrived in the early morning, accompanied by Claudia. The staff, recognizing him, ushered him into a private consultation with Dr. Warner, the lead surgeon. Dr. Warner explained the severity of Elizabeth's condition. She was in a coma, and it was unclear if or when she would regain consciousness. The unborn child's health hung in the balance. Xavier's face paled, but before he could fully process the enormity of the situation, Claudia took charge. With a calculated voice, she asked, "Doctor, in cases like this, how often do the mothers pull through?" Dr. Warner frowned. "We've seen miraculous recoveries, but the odds are uncertain. It could be days, weeks, or months. The baby is at risk if Elizabeth's condition worsens." Claudia's expression morphed into feigned concern. "That's so tragic. Thank you, doctor, for all that you're doing." She lightly squeezed Xavier's arm, guiding him out of earshot. In a hospital corridor where fluorescent lights cast long shadows, Claudia's words dripped with insinuation. "This is no way for Elizabeth to live. Xavier, you've heard the doctor. She may never regain consciousness, and the baby might not survive. What if it's best to let nature take its course?" Xavier's eyes misted with conflict. "One, I can't just give up on Elizabeth or our child." Yet, as he spoke, his voice trembled with the weight of it all. "I understand," Claudia replied softly. "But think about the future. Think about your businesses, your responsibilities. If Elizabeth remains like this, you'll be tethered to hospital decisions for who knows how long. That's no life for her or for you." Days of pressure, swirling rumors, and mounting legal questions ensued. The Lancaster name was splashed across tabloids, speculating on the condition of the wife, the unborn heir, and the possibility of scandal. Claudia whispered incessantly about the implications of indefinite medical bills, the draining emotional toll, and how the media might twist the story into one of neglect or exploitation. Despite Dr. Warner's cautious optimism, Claudia pressed Xavier to consider a radical step, having Elizabeth declared legally dead if her condition showed no signs of improvement. At first, he recoiled in horror. "That's monstrous," he muttered. But Claudia was nothing if not persuasive. She spoke of mercy, of freeing Elizabeth from a fate worse than death. She stressed how the doctors themselves didn't sound hopeful. With every conversation, she chipped away at Xavier's resolve, capitalizing on his exhaustion, guilt, and fear. In moments when rationality tried to resurface, Claudia resorted to more direct manipulations. She subtly questioned Elizabeth's loyalty, hinting that the baby might not even be Xavier's, stoking the embers of paranoia. The corporate deals also hung precariously in the balance, threatened by the swirl of scandal. For every shred of decency left in Xavier's heart, Claudia had a counter-argument. Within a week, Xavier found himself in a room with a private attorney, discussing the unimaginable. He hadn't fully accepted what he was about to do, but Claudia's gentle yet relentless presence prodded him onward. He was no longer certain if it was his decision or hers. And so he signed papers that would forever change his life, the beginning of the process to declare his comatose wife legally deceased. Unbeknownst to everyone, Elizabeth woke, if only for brief intervals. Semi-conscious, drifting in and out of a haze, she sometimes overheard snatches of conversation, nurses bustling in the corridors, the faint beep of machines. Once, she heard a voice that sounded painfully like Xavier's, discussing the funeral arrangements with a note of finality in his tone. Yet, when she tried to open her eyes or move her lips, her body betrayed her with paralysis. In one of those fleeting moments, a nurse named Karen, who had recognized Elizabeth from social media photos, leaned over her bed. Concern etched on her face, Karen muttered. "They're saying you're dead, sweetie. That can't be right." The nurse gently stroked Elizabeth's hair, as if urging her to fight. Elizabeth's heartbeat escalated, though she could barely move a muscle. Her mind reeled in confusion. Why would Xavier declare her dead when she was still alive, lying here in a hospital bed? She wanted to cry out, to protest, but the only sign of her awareness was a tear rolling down her cheek. A few days later, the hospital staff was informed that Elizabeth's life support would be withdrawn upon final legal clearance. Under the directive of her widower, her care was gradually scaled back. Medications were reduced, and certain non-essential machines were switched off. Dr. Warner had his reservations, but faced with an onslaught of legal papers and with Xavier's wealth and influence overshadowing the situation, he reluctantly complied. But Nurse Karen refused to stand by and do nothing. She reached out to Elizabeth's distant cousin, Mark Moretti, who worked as a small-town attorney in Massachusetts. Mark had heard about the accident, but was under the impression that Elizabeth had already passed. Upon receiving Karen's phone call, his outrage was immediate. He drove to New York in a fury, determined to see Elizabeth for himself. When Mark arrived, however, he discovered Elizabeth had been inexplicably transferred to a private hospice facility, a place typically used for patients with terminal prognoses. Everyone kept repeating the same line: "Elizabeth Lancaster is legally deceased." It was as though an official stamp had been pressed on her life, and no one dared question it. With dogged persistence, Mark demanded answers. He invoked his familial connection and threatened legal action if he was denied access. Eventually, under pressure, the hospice administration relented. Accompanied by an administrator, Mark stepped into a serene pastel-colored room. There on a bed, hooked to minimal life support, lay Elizabeth. Her chest rose and fell faintly. Mark's eyes welled with tears as he saw the tubes and monitors that confirmed she was, in fact, still alive. Yet the staff behaved as though they were merely waiting for her last breath. If not for the determined nurse's tip-off, Elizabeth would have likely slipped away in silent tragedy, never to awaken. In those quiet hours, with the wind rustling outside the window, Elizabeth dreamed. She dreamed of betrayals, whispered conversations, and the vow she had made to protect her child. Though trapped in a limbo of half-consciousness, her spirit, like a candle flame, refused to go out. Across town, life had carried on for Xavier and Claudia, though it was far from tranquil. Officially, Xavier presented himself as a grieving widower, stoic in the face of reporters seeking a statement on Elizabeth's supposed death. Claudia, ever the calculated strategist, organized a private memorial ceremony, a quiet affair, just enough to quell public curiosity, but not so grand as to invite deeper scrutiny. This memorial took place in a discreet chapel, where a small circle of acquaintances, business associates, and loyal staff attended out of obligation or sympathy. No casket was displayed, only a large gilded photo of Elizabeth. During the brief eulogy, Xavier's voice betrayed an edge of guilt, though he masked it as sorrow. Claudia stood by him, her eyes moist enough to appear suitably mournful. Privately, however, Claudia revelled in her newfound position. Freed from the moral weight of having Elizabeth physically present, she moved openly into Xavier's penthouse. She redecorated the living space in her own style, sleek white furniture, modern art, and minimalistic lines, replacing any trace of Elizabeth's influence. She took on the role of hostess at Xavier's dinner parties, forging alliances with power brokers who might bolster Xavier's next round of ventures, but trouble brewed beneath the surface. For one thing, Xavier was not the puppet Claudia hoped he would be. Yes, he'd been manipulated into declaring Elizabeth dead, but the enormity of that act gnawed at him. Late at night, he paced the penthouse halls, haunted by memories. Sometimes he pictured Elizabeth's smile, the way she touched her abdomen in anticipation of their child. The guilt assaulted him with a force that no brandy or sleeping pill could subdue. Claudia sensed his turmoil and tried various tactics to distract or placate him. She whispered seductive promises about their future, painting visions of exotic vacations and philanthropic galas that would cement their status as the city's power couple. She attempted to drown out Xavier's regrets with work, encouraging him to immerse himself in new ventures. But the vacuum left by Elizabeth's absence was profound, and no matter how Claudia tried, she couldn't fully fill it. The press, meanwhile, offered an unexpected challenge. Rumors swirled that Elizabeth's accident seemed suspiciously timed. Blogs and tabloids reported that Elizabeth's remains were never publicly confirmed. Anonymous online forums buzzed with conspiracy theories. A single photograph leaked of Elizabeth's battered car at the crash site, fueling speculation that her condition might have been survivable. While most mainstream media outlets dismissed these rumors as mere tabloid fodder, the seeds of doubt were planted. Claudia and Xavier's public appearances grew more tense. Paparazzi hounded them with questions about why no body was ever seen, where the official death certificate was filed, and why immediate family members hadn't issued public statements of mourning. Claudia's meticulously crafted plans were beginning to show cracks. Desperate to protect their narrative, Claudia doubled down on controlling the message. She leaned on her PR background, feeding journalists selective quotes and offering them exclusives on upcoming business deals in exchange for burying suspicion. But no matter how many stories she fed to the press, a nagging thought remained. If even one person found Elizabeth alive, everything would unravel. And that person, unknown to them, was already working behind the scenes to reveal the truth. In the quiet hospice room, Mark Moretti kept vigil by Elizabeth's bedside. He hired a private nurse, Jane Thornton, who was known for her expertise in neurological recoveries. Together, they orchestrated a plan to provide Elizabeth with the physical therapy and medical attention she had been denied. Slowly, signs of progress emerged. Elizabeth began moving her fingers. Then her eyes flickered open for seconds at a time. Nurse Jane's face glowed with optimism. "There's a real chance she'll come out of this," she told Mark. "But she needs the best care possible, uninterrupted." Knowing that the legal situation was precarious, Elizabeth had been declared deceased by her husband. Mark approached the hospital's legal counsel, but he found himself stonewalled. The official documents were ironclad. If Elizabeth had been misdiagnosed or wrongly declared dead, it would be a scandal of epic proportions. Administrators were wary of involving themselves in a case that could topple powerful individuals. Undeterred, Mark reached out to a journalist acquaintance, Rachel Kim, at the New York Herald. Initially, Rachel was skeptical. "You're telling me the late Elizabeth Lancaster, the pregnant wife of a millionaire, is still alive in a hospice, and her husband declared her dead anyway?" Her tone carried disbelief. "Yes," Mark insisted, "and I have proof medical records showing she's still on minimal life support. I can get you access if you come quietly." Rachel, sensing a bombshell, agreed to investigate. Late at night, she snuck into the hospice with Mark, wearing a discreet hoodie and carrying nothing but a small camera. What she witnessed in that private room shook her to the core. Elizabeth Lancaster, fragile but undeniably alive, her belly still slightly rounded with pregnancy. With trembling hands, Rachel snapped photographs. She recorded Nurse Jane's statement, "This patient is very much alive. She's responding to stimulus." The shocking evidence contradicted the official narrative. Rachel knew she sat on a career-defining scoop, but also a story so big that it could jeopardize her own safety if powerful forces tried to bury it. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Mark prepared to challenge Elizabeth's death certificate in court. Armed with the new evidence, he filed an emergency motion, claiming that Elizabeth was in fact alive and that the legal declaration of her death had been fraudulent. If the court recognized his argument, it would trigger a massive legal showdown with Xavier Lancaster. As Mark's motions inched through the system, the first real glimmer of hope ignited. Each day, Elizabeth grew a little stronger. Her eyelids fluttered more frequently. Her hand sometimes gripped Mark's. Once, late in the evening, Nurse Jane gasped as Elizabeth's lips parted to murmur a barely audible word, "baby." For the first time since the accident, it felt as though Elizabeth was fighting her way back, driven by maternal instincts and an unyielding will. The documents labeling her deceased might have fooled the city, but they had not fooled her body or spirit. A mother's love, after all, can be a powerful force capable of transcending even the darkest betrayals. While Elizabeth waged her silent battle for survival, Xavier's world began to crumble. Whispers reached him that someone had challenged Elizabeth's death certificate. He tried to brush it off as a sick hoax, possibly orchestrated by unscrupulous lawyers looking for a payout. Yet, the rumors refused to die. The tension between Claudia and Xavier escalated. The once intoxicating infatuation that united them had cooled, replaced by constant bickering. Each new mention of Elizabeth's name in the media triggered an argument. "Why is this story popping up again?" Claudia snapped one morning, hurling a tabloid onto the kitchen table. The headline blared, "Is Elizabeth Lancaster really dead?" Xavier massaged his temples. The guilt he had managed to bury was resurfacing with a vengeance. "Maybe we made a mistake," he muttered, staring at the headline. "If there's any chance she's alive—" Claudia interrupted, eyes wild with fear. "Don't even think about it. We followed the legal and medical advice. You heard the doctors say her chances were slim. We were told it was hopeless." Her voice quivered, betraying her desperation to maintain control. In the corridors of power, certain business associates began to distance themselves from Xavier. They feared the scandal might tarnish their own reputations. Deals that were once sealed without question suddenly fell through, and investors pulled out. The Lancaster name, once associated with visionary success, now carried a pungent whiff of controversy. Adding to the maelstrom, Mark Moretti's legal challenge gained traction. A judge agreed to an expedited hearing to investigate potential fraud or misrepresentation in the matter of Elizabeth Lancaster's presumed death. Subpoenas were issued for hospital records, witness testimonies, and financial documents. The hearing date loomed like a dark cloud over Xavier's schedule. Behind the scenes, Rachel Kim quietly prepared her expose for the New York Herald. She double-checked every fact, interviewed additional hospital staff, and reached out to Mark for updates on Elizabeth's condition. If published, her article would be a grenade tossed into the heart of high society. Rumors hinted that she even had photographic evidence. Xavier hired a team of high-priced attorneys to try to block publication, but time was running short. The final blow to Claudia's veneer of confidence came when she received a text message from a blocked number that simply read, "I have proof you coerced him. Meet me at the old docks if you want to keep it quiet." Her heart pounded, as she read and re-read the message. Who could have sent it? Did someone have recordings of her persuading Xavier to declare Elizabeth dead? Panicking, Claudia confronted Xavier. "We have to find out who's behind this. They're blackmailing us." Xavier, exhausted by the mounting chaos, snapped back, "There is no us. You dragged me into this. If Elizabeth is alive, I'll do everything I can to fix this, no matter the cost." His words stung Claudia like a lash, and for the first time, her composure shattered. She realized Xavier was slipping out of her grasp. With the hearing just days away, both the mistress and the so-called widower were forced to reckon with the possibility that Elizabeth was not only alive, but might reclaim her name, her fortune, and even her child, exposing their darkest secrets in the process. The day dawned grey and cold, a bleak sky hanging low over the city. In the private hospice room, Elizabeth's fingers curled around Mark's hand. The sound of raindrops tapping on the windows was almost comforting, a rhythmic backdrop to her shallow breathing. Nurse Jane hovered nearby, adjusting the fourth lines and checking monitors. Then something miraculous happened. Elizabeth's eyes opened and held steady, no longer the fleeting flickers of previous days. She tried to speak, her voice dry and hoarse. Mark leaned in. "Elizabeth, can you hear me?" A pained whisper emerged. "Xavier, baby." Tears welled in Mark's eyes. "You're safe," he reassured her. "I'm here. We're taking care of you. Don't try to rush anything." Despite her weakened state, Elizabeth's gaze sharpened with an urgency Mark recognized. She clutched at his sleeve, her lips trembling as she forced out her next words. "He declared me dead. Why?" Mark gently explained what had happened, avoiding the most distressing details. He told her about Claudia's influence, about the legal battle, and about how the courts were now forced to re-examine the case. Elizabeth's face contorted with a mixture of shock and heartbreak. "Why would he do that?" she finally asked, tears slipping down her cheeks. Words failed Mark. He could only hug her gently. Nurse Jane stepped forward to remind them that Elizabeth needed to rest, but Elizabeth insisted on more answers. Her baby, was it still alive? Was she still pregnant? Nurse Jane gave a comforting smile. "Your baby has been a fighter, just like you. From the tests we've conducted, the heartbeat is steady, but we need to do more comprehensive scans." Relief coursed through Elizabeth, mingling with fury and confusion. She vowed that once she recovered, she would uncover every sordid detail of how her own husband had written her off for dead. For the sake of her child, she would see justice done. Although her body was frail, Elizabeth's spirit surged with renewed strength. She spent the next few days in a whirlwind of medical evaluations. Specialists were brought in, including Dr. Sophia Hayashi, who had been her original OB-GYN. After thoroughly examining Elizabeth, Sophia confirmed that while the pregnancy remained high risk, there was still hope for a healthy outcome if Elizabeth continued to recover. Outside the hospice walls, Mark worked tirelessly with his legal team, updating the court on Elizabeth's improving condition. The media caught wind of this stunning development, and rumors exploded. The woman once mourned as dead was, by all reports, alive. Public opinion veered from sympathy for Xavier to outrage at the potential conspiracy. Claudia's name trended on social media, with whispers that she had orchestrated the entire fiasco. As Elizabeth regained the ability to sit up, speak more clearly, and even take a few steps with assistance, she felt a surge of maternal resolve. She knew that no matter how complicated the coming fight might be, she was determined to face it head-on. What she didn't know was just how far Claudia would go to keep the truth buried, and how dangerous the final showdown could be for everyone involved. The marble steps of the New York Supreme Court were swarmed with reporters and flashing cameras. Rain threatened to fall from the heavy sky, casting a gloomy haze over the city. Tension buzzed in the air as journalists murmured, cameramen adjusted their tripods, and legal spectators jockeyed for seats. Everyone was there for one reason: to witness the unbelievable showdown of a woman once declared dead, now very much alive. Inside the grand courtroom, polished wood gleamed under the soft lighting. Rows of pew-like benches were packed with observers and media representatives. The courtroom doors creaked open, and Xavier Lancaster entered, flanked by 3 attorneys. He looked tired, a shadow of the charismatic millionaire the public once adored. His navy suit was perfectly pressed, but his eyes were bloodshot, his face pale. As he walked to his seat, cameras clicked rapidly outside the courtroom window panes. Moments later, Claudia Ramirez entered from a separate side door, wearing an elegant black suit dress and oversized sunglasses. Her jaw was clenched tight, her usual confident smirk replaced with a hard, unreadable line. Whispers spread as her name was murmured in disgust. She avoided eye contact with everyone and slid silently into her chair behind her legal team. Then came the moment that silenced the room. Elizabeth Lancaster entered, her presence stopping all movement. Seated in a wheelchair, pushed gently by Nurse Jane, she wore a flowing pale blue maternity dress that draped softly over her baby bump. Though her body still bore the fragility of recovery bruises, faintly visible on her arms, a thinness around her cheeks, her expression was calm and defiant. Her dark hair was pinned neatly back, and her eyes, alert and unwavering, scanned the room. Behind her, Mark Moretti walked closely, offering strength without speaking a word. Gasps filled the courtroom. "She's alive," someone whispered audibly. Even the judge, Honorable Julia Park, looked momentarily stunned before quickly collecting herself. She banged her gavel for silence. "We are here today," Judge Park began, her tone crisp, "to review the legal declaration of death filed for Mistress, Elizabeth Lancaster, and to determine whether that declaration was made in error or under circumstances of fraud and coercion." One by one, key witnesses were called. Nurse Karen gave a powerful testimony about Elizabeth's vital signs after the accident and her repeated protests when life support was quietly scaled back. Dr. Warner, the attending physician, admitted uncomfortably that while the prognosis was grim, Elizabeth was never officially brain dead. Then came the recorded audio played aloud by Mark Moretti with permission from the court. Claudia's voice echoed in the courtroom, cold and calculating. "If you want to move on with your life, let them pull the plug. Consider her dead and be done with it." The silence that followed was deafening. Xavier was called to the stand next. He looked visibly shaken. I thought I was doing the right thing," he stammered. "I believed the doctors." Claudia said there was no hope. "I didn't know, but you made no attempt to wait. You didn't consult her family. You didn't allow time." "Why?" Mark's voice was sharp. Xavier looked down, his voice barely audible. "Because I was tired, and I let someone else convince me what was easiest was what was right. Then Claudia was called to testify." She removed her sunglasses slowly, revealing tired, bloodshot eyes. Her voice was tight, defensive. "I did not force Xavier to do anything. I merely supported his decision based on what doctors advised." "You were also living in his penthouse 3 days after the accident. How do you explain that?" Mark asked, cool and steady. Claudia's eyes flared. "We were grieving confused. It wasn't what it looked like." Mark presented emails, timestamps and text messages, ones that painted a far different picture. Claudia had not only encouraged Xavier to declare Elizabeth dead, she had actively worked behind the scenes to expedite the process. The judge leaned forward. "Miss Ramirez, you will refrain from further comments. This court has reason to believe you may have manipulated a vulnerable man into making a life-altering, possibly criminal decision." When the gavel finally struck at the end of the session, Judge Park's voice echoed across the courtroom. "It is the ruling of this court that the declaration of death for Elizabeth Lancaster is null and void. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate investigation into the actions taken by Claudia Ramirez and any participating parties. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed to capture Elizabeth's first steps back into the world. She paused briefly, looking out at the sea of cameras. Her voice was soft but steady as she said, "I was silenced, nearly erased. But I'm here now, and I intend to protect myself and my child." Xavier watched her from afar, emotion raw on his face. Claudia stood frozen, knowing the empire she tried to steal had just slipped through her fingers, exposed, dismantled, and burned under the spotlight of truth. During the recess, Elizabeth sat in a private waiting room, her nerves frayed. She glanced at her reflection in a large mirror, scarcely recognizing the bruised, frail woman staring back. Yet, behind the physical wear and tear, a fierce determination shone in her eyes. Mark sat beside her, hand on her shoulder. "No matter what happens next, you've already won the most important battle. You're alive. Your baby is alive." She smiled faintly, eyes welling with tears. Though she had dreaded confronting Xavier, she knew it was necessary. At her request, he entered the room alone, his face drawn with remorse. His gaze fell on her belly, as though finally acknowledging the life growing there. "Elizabeth," he began, voice trembling. I'm sorry. I never should have listened to Claudia. But the doctors said..." She cut him off. "Don't you dare place all the blame on the doctors. You declared me dead, Xavier. You turned your back on me." Anger and pain collided in her voice. She placed a protective hand over her abdomen. "You nearly cost our child its life." Tears welled in Xavier's eyes. "I was weak, confused. That's no excuse, I know. But I swear, if I'd known there was even a glimmer of hope, I never would have." He trailed off, unable to finish. A long silence passed, thick with regret and unspoken accusations. Elizabeth finally broke it. "I'm going to focus on my recovery and on our child. If there's any chance of forgiveness, Xavier, you'll have to earn it by proving you can put our child's well-being first." Xavier nodded, tears sliding down his cheeks. In that moment, the weight of his betrayal pressed down on him more heavily than ever. When the court reconvened, Judge Park wasted little time delivering her decision. The declaration of Elizabeth Lancaster's death was overturned, effective immediately. The judge found that the documents were filed under extremely questionable circumstances, influenced by Claudia's manipulations and Xavier's neglect of due diligence. A separate inquiry was recommended to investigate any criminal wrongdoing, including conspiracy to commit fraud and potential endangerment of Elizabeth's welfare. Claudia's expression froze in shock. Her attorneys whispered frantically as the judge's words sealed her fate. She faced the very real possibility of charges that could lead to prison time. Outside the courthouse, reporters and onlookers surged forward, clamoring for a statement from the woman who had returned from the dead. Elizabeth, supported by Mark on one side and Nurse Jane on the other, gave a brief remark. "I am grateful to be alive and for the support I've received. I ask for privacy as I focus on my recovery and the health of my unborn child." Camera bulbs flashed, capturing the image of a fragile yet triumphant Elizabeth. In the background, Xavier looked on with a torn expression, relief that Elizabeth was alive, shame for his role in nearly destroying her, and a faint hope that, somehow, he might find redemption. For Claudia, there was no solace. Surrounded by photographers, she kept her head down, her once carefully curated persona shattered. She had underestimated the resilience of a woman's will to live, the power of familial love, and the potent sting of truth. Months later, Elizabeth reclined in a sunlit reading nook, gently caressing her now prominent baby bump. The doctors had placed her on bed rest for the final stages of her high-risk pregnancy, but her spirit was high. She was regaining her strength, physically and emotionally. With each passing day, she felt the life inside her growing stronger, reminding her of a future that had nearly been stolen. Xavier had moved back to the estate temporarily at Elizabeth's cautious invitation. He slept in a guest wing, far from her private suite, but she allowed him some involvement in prenatal appointments. Their conversations were polite but guarded. Trust, as they both knew, would not be easily rebuilt. In the aftermath of the court case, Claudia's reputation was left in tatters. Indicted on charges of fraud and conspiracy, she spent her days embroiled in legal battles. Most of Xavier's business associates cut ties with her immediately, and she found herself largely abandoned by the high society circles she once courted. A once rising star in PR, she now saw every door slammed shut. Elizabeth had declined to press additional charges for emotional distress, prioritizing her recovery over vengeance. Still, civil suits were likely, given the harm done. Mark continued to serve as Elizabeth's legal champion, ensuring that no further manipulations would threaten her or her unborn child. Nurse Jane remained a trusted caregiver, monitoring Elizabeth's health as she inched closer to her due date. As for the media frenzy, it finally began to subside, replaced by newer scandals and headlines. Rachel Kim's expose in the New York Herald had garnered awards for investigative journalism, shining a spotlight on medical malpractice and the ease with which legal documents could be manipulated by those with power and money. The article also praised the unwavering determination of Elizabeth and her supporters. One crisp morning, Elizabeth received a letter from an unlikely source, Xavier's mother, Eloise Lancaster, who had been traveling abroad. Eloise wrote of her shock and sorrow upon hearing the news, apologizing for not being there during Elizabeth's darkest hour. She expressed relief that Elizabeth was still alive, regret for Xavier's actions, and a fervent hope for reconciliation. Unsure how to respond, Elizabeth tucked the letter away in a drawer, overwhelmed by the complexities of what her life had become. In the final weeks of her pregnancy, Elizabeth had moments of reflection on love, trust, betrayal, and survival. She grieved for the vibrant woman she had once been, who believed wholeheartedly in the fairy tale narrative of her marriage. Yet, she also embraced the new, stronger version of herself that emerged from adversity. She understood, perhaps more than ever, that life was fragile, precious, and worth fighting for. On a morning awash with soft sunlight filtering through the estate's tall windows, Elizabeth felt the first stirrings of labor. Gathering the strength that had carried her through heartbreak and near death, she prepared to welcome her child into a world that was both perilous and full of promise. And as each contraction rippled through her, she reminded herself miracles do happen, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. Thank you for joining me on this emotional roller coaster of betrayal, secrets, and survival. Elizabeth's miraculous journey from being declared dead to reclaiming her life and safeguarding the life of her unborn child reminds us all of the power of hope and resilience. She faced unimaginable treachery from the very people she trusted, yet found the strength to stand tall for herself and her baby. If this story moved you, intrigued you, or left you breathless with anticipation, please consider giving this video a like. Don't forget to share it with friends who appreciate a gripping real-life drama, and most importantly, subscribe to this channel so you won't miss any future stories. Your support helps us continue bringing you tales that spark conversation, curiosity, and even a glimmer of inspiration. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more riveting narratives.